Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. Born and bred in Sydney as I am, there are few things that represent home to me more than the Harbour Bridge and the Opera House. I still catch my breath whenever I see these iconic landmarks on the final leg of a flight into Sydney or watching the New Year's Eve's fireworks. I'm fascinated by the history of these structures, by the vision of those who designed them, and of the sacrifice of many who worked on them, particularly the Sydney Opera House. So when I learned of a book that goes behind the scenes of an opera production at the Sydney Opera House, a book that takes us back in time to the very first opera publicly performed on that fated stage, I knew I had to read it. The Understudy, published by Simon & Schuster, is author Julie Bennett's debut novel, a novel that was inspired by the Sydney Opera House itself as much as her own childhood. A fascinating, page-turning glimpse into the underbelly of the theatre world, along with the rivalries, politics and machinations behind a history-making performance in 1973 Sydney. I am in awe of Julie's achievement with this magnificent novel, and I'm delighted to welcome her to the podcast today. Hi, Julie.
Hi, Claudine. Thanks so much for having me.
It's my pleasure. Congratulations on this incredible novel.
Thank you.
And I know how long and hard this road has been for you. So tell me what it feels like to finally see your gorgeous novel out in the world.
It has a little bit of a dream quality. You know, it's you work for a very long time on something and you become very involved in it and it becomes your life. I mean, I absolutely bored my sons senseless talking about the book, and they were ever so patient. They never wanted me to stop or never told me to stop talking about it. But it becomes part of, you know, what you talk about and who you are, I guess. And so to see it finally being actually born is like, oh, that's good. It's like it's a little bit like when you have a baby, you just grow the baby and you never see the face until the baby's born, and then it's born and you go, wow. So, and of course I saw the Ark as well, which had a slightly different cover, and then the actual book was out in the market, and it's a dream. It's a dream come true.
Do you remember the day that you decided you were going to write this novel?
I sure do. I woke up one day in my 50s and I realized that if I didn't get cracking, I was never going to do what I said I'd always wanted to do. So I remember exactly where I was, and I really had a bit of a stern lecture with myself. I said, you know, my whole life I had thought that I was a writer, that I was an author. And I went, well, that's all very well. You know, I'd scribbled a lot. I'd had some practice novels and they weren't published. And I went, you call yourself a writer, but you haven't actually published anything, like not in the form of a book. So I'd been a journalist and I'd published things as a journalist, obviously. But I was like very cross with myself that here I was in my 50s and I hadn't done what I said I would do. And for me, this particular book was a book that was born a long time ago. The idea was born a long time ago when I worked in libraries, and a librarian said to me, you know, you should write a book inspired by your family's background in opera, because people would be absolutely fascinated with that. And I think I've said this somewhere before, but the thing is that my dad was an opera singer, right? And for me, it was a little bit like, well, who'd be interested in my dad's job? And then you realize it's not just a job, right? It's a whole world, and a world that a lot of people never get to experience. And that's what informed the background, you know, so much. And so this day that I woke up, I said, okay, now that you have decided you're going to write this book, you need to work out how you're going to get it published. So that's when I went to Fiona McIntosh's masterclass, and I was actually on a wait list and I wasn't due to go for a year. So she said, you know, you're going to have 10 pages of the novel ready when you come to masterclass next year. And I went, oh, a whole year to write a book. Cool. And then there was an opening much earlier than anticipated. In fact, a really last minute opening, and I had nothing. So I just quickly dashed off 10 pages as she requested. And interestingly, hardly any of those first 10 pages have changed. So that's really interesting.
Oh, wow. That is fascinating.
I know, really interesting. So that's how it was born. And I just I had a stern talking to myself.
Now, both you and I have already mentioned that this book was inspired by the Opera House and your family background. I know there's more, so tell me how this novel came to be.
My family migrated to Australia in my father came over a couple of years earlier, I think, to join the Australian Opera Company. And then we came a little while later. I was 9 when we came to Australia, and I was 11 when the Sydney Opera House opened. And I'm going to be honest here, when I was 9, I really missed my home country of New Zealand, because all our family was still there. And it was just our nuclear family in Australia. I really missed, and I'd lived next door to my best friend. And we moved in May, and in June, my grandfather died. And I was so close to my grandfather. He was just, he lived nearby. My grandparents lived nearby, and he died in June. And I was heartbroken. I was a heartbroken little girl. And of course, the whole family couldn't afford to go back to New Zealand. In those days, it was quite expensive to travel across the Tasman. So only Dad went back for the funeral. And I was just a heartbroken little girl. Then we were recruited to join the chorus of the extras. They're called supernumeraries in opera as children in War and Peace, which is generally accepted as the first opera performed in the Sydney Opera House. And that was in September 73. And, going onto the stage in that brand new opera house, it was magic. And it was a world where all your little childhood troubles disappeared. You just became part of the fabric of the scene that you were in. You just forgot everything else. You became part of that world. And so for me, and I know this is not true, cannot be true, but for me, the Sydney Opera House was my home, my house. I still think of it as mine, as my Sydney home. And I will never, ever forget how it felt to be on that stage. Of course, another story I've often told is how I thought it was so cool on stage. I walk on stage, and you're supposed to, stage directions are, you walk on stage, you just walk across the stage at the end of the scene and you exit, right? So I thought I was so cool, but the footage I saw of myself, and it was up on the Opera Australia website recently, the first production performed, and there I am, like gawking all around me, looking at the lights and looking at the scenery, and I thought I'd been part of the action really well, but but you got used to it. The more times you did it, the more you were used to it. But yeah, so the Sydney Opera House I'm very, very fond of it. And to me, it's just the essence of Sydney. It's beautiful, it's bold, it's right there on our beautiful harbour. And I hope that what this novel does is inspire people to fall in love with Sydney, and perhaps even for those who don't live in Sydney or who don't live in Australia, perhaps fall in love with Australia, because it is a fantastic country and so beautiful.
Okay, Julie, so for those who haven't heard of your novel yet, can you tell me more about it? Tell me who the understudy is and what her story is.
The understudy is Sophie Carlton. So Sophie has to step up into the spotlight when the prima donna goes missing. The prima donna is Margaret Gardner. So Sophie has been in the chorus, but she's a very ambitious young woman, and she is not going to let anything stand in the way of progressing her career. So she's very, very pleased to be the understudy, but she doesn't think she'll ever have the opportunity to perform on stage on the first night, on the opening night of the Sydney Opera House. It's beyond the realms of her thinking. So Margaret mysteriously disappears just a little while before the opening production is due to be performed. And Sophie has to step up on stage at the very last minute, out of the chorus and into the leading role. And of course, she steps straight into the arms of the Italian tenor, who's a very famous Italian tenor. And from there, she makes her fabulous principal debut. And she's so well received. But of course, in the background, there's the disappearance of Margaret to try and work out, where's Margaret gone? What's happened to her? Why would she miss opening night, and such an opening night, the opening of our opera house? So it is a story of ambition, but it's also a love story, and it's also this story of mystery of what's gone on, and it's a little bit, I say that it's historical, of course, because it's set in the 70s and the 50s, So it is an ambition and love story, but it's also a little bit dark, because what happens to Margaret, we need to find what happens to Margaret, and that's a dark tale.
I was going to say that it's a dual timeline narrative in that, and both are historical timelines, one in 53 and one in 73. So one focuses on prima donna Margaret Gardner and the other is on Margaret's understudy, Sophie Carlton. So I wanted to know, and these characters were so complex and so well drawn in the narrative. Were they based on real life characters?
Oh, I get asked that a lot. So no, they're not. And but it's very interesting the way that they developed. So I understand Sophie very, very well. Now, people ask me, how do you understand her so well? I mean, well, maybe it's being around opera people. Maybe it's, my family background. I don't really know, but probably that. I met a lot of opera people in the 30 years that my dad was an opera singer, but it's more than that. And it's fantastic that I still have my parents around to discuss my book with them. And, I said to Dad, like, I know this person so well. And he goes, well, it's a book about opera, but it's also a book about human relationships. You see in life ambitious people, you see in life people who prefer to be in the shadows, you see in life, taciturn people, you see all sorts of people. So what you've just observed people as much as the opera, the ambience of the opera. And I think also the thing about Sophie is that as women, we know what it's like to try to carve a career and the challenges that come in our way. And I think perhaps then, I was a child in the 70s, I wasn't an adult, so I don't know, if I'm not speaking from experience, but I think it was a little bit more complex then, in the sense that we were pushing for women's rights and we were pushing for progress, but we hadn't quite got there yet. There were some services where people had to resign when they got married. It's just a world in which we don't have to resign when we get married, for example. It was a different era. So Sophie is driven by this: I'm going to be successful. I'm going to have a plan. I'm going to tick points off the plan, and I'm not getting distracted because I know what I want. So, the strength of Sophie's character in that is that she recognizes the things that maybe get in the way for women performers, and she's trying not to fall down that path. Of course, she does fall down one path, but we don't want to give too many spoilers away. Margaret is obviously a much more difficult character. So Margaret is the older diva, and she's had a difficult past. And so what she's done is she's pushed on despite her past, but it does come at a cost for Margaret. And I think that's also a little bit of a difference between the two eras that the two women grew up in. And I think Margaret, I don't know Margaret as well, better than anyone else, I suppose, but she wasn't as clear to me as Sophie in drawing her. But what happened was she was a real voice in my head. Margaret was a consistent and persistent voice in my head. And believe me, I tried to quieten her down, because Margaret would go into my head and go, write this, tell them this, say this, show them that. And it was like, okay, I hear you, Margaret. I hear you. So where does that sort of thing come from? I don't know. I don't think I'm crazy. I might be. I think maybe what it comes from is, reading a lot about women from eras that are not your own, and trying to understand what their problems and difficulties were, and what sort of a person you would have to be to try and overcome that. So Sophie I knew really well from the very beginning, but Margaret was the loudest voice in my head.
You've done an incredible job of bringing your backstage experiences to the page in this novel, and I particularly love the insight into the staging and timings and how this was managed.
Yeah.
So was this based on your own experiences, or did you need to do additional research to clarify this and maybe speak to your dad? Or
Yeah, so I spent a lot of time talking to my father, who's fabulous. And not just, my father was a professional singer, and that's an artistic temperament. And I mean that as in, you have to be very talented to sing at that level. And so you're very conscious of things, so conscious of protecting the voice. It was a big deal in my family. You can't yell. And he was always saying, there's girls, no yelling, because it can damage your voice. And colds and flus and things were really difficult to manage, because you needed a voice to sing. And so he is very conscious of those sorts of things and very well informed in music and theatre, and very helpful, obviously, about, being on the things that would happen on stage. But of course, Dad's been retired a little while, so I wanted to, of course, I also had my own experience, but I was only 11, maybe, 12. I probably did it for a couple of years. And so your memory is a terrible author. So I did a backstage tour of the Opera House, again, to familiarise myself. Still just felt like home to me. It just felt exactly as I felt when I was 11. The smell of it, it's not just the look of the Opera House, which is spectacular outside and certainly in the theatres, but the smell of it just will stay with me forever. It's this smell that you're instantly back in the Sydney Opera House and you could not be anywhere else. It's like salt and sea and earth and concrete. There's a medley of smells. But as for the stage directions, sorry to blab on.
Fascinating stuff.
I obviously consulted a lot of non-fiction works that had been written by artists and members of companies, and I read a lot of blogs of practicing opera singers today. But I was also helped a lot by a production stage manager, Annika Harrison, who's acknowledged in my book. And at that stage, so I wrote the whole book, I revised the whole book, I edited the whole book about 1,020 times. Okay, 10. And then I was reasonably, happy is the wrong word, but I was reasonably okay with what I'd done in respect to the staging. But I don't know if you're like this, but it's like this perfectionism thing that drives you, that I don't want a little thing to trip up my story. So I don't want to be overly pedantic about getting every single stage thing right, but I want it to be authentic. So I asked Annika to help me with a few things, but really quite minor things. And that was just so helpful. It was just because Annika actually works on productions today in the Sydney Opera House. So, her help was just amazing.
Oh, so brilliant. Now, just to clarify, Madama Butterfly, which was the opera Sophie and Armando were performing in this novel, was not actually the first performance at the Sydney Opera House, was it?
No, it wasn't. So War and Peace was the first, it's considered the first opera performed in the Sydney Opera House. There's a bit of controversy around that because there were some test operas that ran before. And when I was deciding on what to say about the fact that it wasn't Madame Butterfly, I thought, well, I'm going to say what the Sydney Opera House says, and Sydney Opera House says War and Peace was the first. And that's the one that I was in, so that's fine, that's great. So I wanted to choose an opera that hadn't been performed in that year, and I think, I could be wrong, but I think Madame Butterfly wasn't performed until 1978 in the Sydney Opera House. For a start, I didn't want it to be an opera that had been performed because I didn't want anyone to think that they were being portrayed by me in my novel, right? So it was a fictional one. And then I chose Madama Butterfly because I wanted an opera that I thought an understudy might be able to perform spectacularly well. Of course, all understudies are very talented performers in their own right, and I'm sure they could do a great job of being an understudy. But I wanted Sophie to be spectacular in this role so that she wins the hearts and minds of people who are going to be naturally opposed, right? They're not getting the diva. They're not going to be happy about that. I thought Madama Butterfly was a role that she could do well. And I also wanted to do a Puccini opera because I just love Puccini. And I liked Madama Butterfly before. I really enjoyed it, but I love it now. The music is to die for.
In preparation for this interview, I took the opportunity to listen to the most famous aria of Madama Butterfly. I can't say it in Italian, but One Fine Day.
One Fine Day, yes.
Raises the hair on the back of your neck, so it's absolutely beautiful. But I mean, more than those reasons, I'm guessing that this opera suited your story better than something like War and Peace. I mean, operas are another form of storytelling, and this one by, Puccini, as you said, is about unrequited love. But also what I found fascinating about your storytelling, Julie, was the fact that you gave us little glimpses in the novel of the story of Madama Butterfly, and you explained the storyline and cleverly how that kind of echoes what's happening for Sophie at the same time. So tell me about that. Tell me why you chose to include these little glimpses in your storytelling.
It's interesting because I didn't choose it for that reason. I chose it because I wanted to illustrate the differences between someone like Madama Cha San and Sophie. So Sophie's very strong and poor Cha San is not. But I wanted, when I show the vulnerability of Sophie going into that role, particularly the first time, what I wanted to show was that is how you feel before you go on. They call it going on in opera. And it's you have no choice. It feels like you have no choice. You have to go on. You have to do it. You've been trained for it, and you can sing, and you've been given all the help and instruction in the world. But it is an absolutely terrifying experience because there you are in front of thousands. I think it was 1,500 or something in the opera theatre, and it's daunting, and particularly for Sophie at such an auspicious moment in time in history. So I was trying to demonstrate that's how performers feel, and speaking to my dad about it, he goes, you do, of course you get used to being on stage, right? And of course it's your job and blah blah blah, but there are times where it's just like that, for whatever reason. It might be opening night, or it might be some fabulous opera singer from overseas has come to sing with your company or whatever, but there's moments like that, But then once you get on stage, you become enmeshed in that world. And of course, they're all very professional. So, there's something about performance, I think, that makes people vulnerable, much like writing a novel.
Oh, yeah. Don't we know all about that? We've already spoken about Sophie and the fact that she was somebody that you knew quite well, and she knew what she wanted. But in many ways, I mean, she was no ingenue. I mean, she wasn't the innocent girl just looking for her big break. And I loved that complexity in her character. She was someone, as you said, who knew what she wanted. So do you think that was exceptional for a woman of her age and her time?
It's interesting because, as I said, I was a child in the 70s, not an adult, but my mum was an adult, obviously, a woman of the 70s. And I do remember Mum really loved that song by Helen Reddy called I Am Woman, but she wasn't really militant or anything like that. But she just said, you girls can do anything you want to do if you set your mind to it. And she was also quite realistic. She said, there was this sort of idealistic idea in the 50s and 60s that women would stay at home and look after the kids. And she goes, you're going to have to work. Like, just take it from me, you're going to have to work. And she did part-time while we were young, and then full-time when we were older. But she said, you can be whatever you want to be, and you can do whatever you want to do. You just need to set your mind to it. And the thing about that, Claudine, was I believed her, right? I absolutely believed her. So that to me was really empowering. And I think that was an attitude for certainly the people around me. I can't speak to other mothers, but I know that was the attitude around me. And my parents, both of them, encouraged us to pursue what made us happy. And what my mum had said was, you'll have to work, but you can find something that you like doing. And that should be your objective. So in the 70s, it was obviously very different to today. But the fact that my mum did work, and the fact that she became quite successful at what she did, and the fact that I saw in my father's world women become, opera singers and opera stars, just was quite inspiring. And I just thought, I think women have achieved a lot over many decades, and even we just tend to think women weren't quite as progressive before us. But I think we've always had some desire to achieve, and we're just a little more able to do it. Vis-a-vis, we don't have to retire when we get married.
Indeed, well said. The novel didn't shy away from discussion of sex, and it definitely reflected the more liberal attitudes towards sex of the 70s. So to that end, I wondered if you would tell me about writing the love scenes in the novel, and why were they important to the story, do you think?
So you're very right that the 70s was a period of, growing sexual liberation for women in particular. And that came about, of course, after the introduction of the contraceptive pill. And I wanted it to reflect that period in our history, that women were suddenly more at liberty to engage in sex outside marriage, before marriage, during their marriage, hopefully. um, and that, sexual love is a human experience. And I think I wanted it to be the way I thought it might have been. I'm not a person who likes to draw the shades and wander off into the sunset. I think that kind of deprives readers of the actuality. I mean, I'm sure that not everybody has rose petals scattered on their beds or whatever, but in the early days of romance, it's such a thing, isn't it? You're so in love with your partner, or you're so interested in them in that way, that these, it is romantic, and it is a human experience, falling in love or even sexual attraction. It's a human experience. And I just thought I wanted to include it because I feel like that was the time when women were starting to be more free in that realm. Yeah.
Interestingly, both Margaret and Sophie were helped along in their careers by someone they considered to be a mentor or benefactor.
Mm.
Was this something you considered essential to a woman's success in that industry at the time?
I think so. So what I think is that when you decide to become an artist of any kind, you need help. You need people to encourage and support you and to give you the right direction. So you and I both know, I'm sure, many, many talented people who should be stars in their field, but somehow have never really made the right connections because they don't know how. And the reason that they don't know how is because they become very focused on, say, in this case, the voice, and not focused on pursuing that as a career. And I think that's something that certainly women have learned, if you like to use that word, but discovered, I guess, as we moved into the 21st century. We've discovered it's not just about being good at what we do or being great at what we do. It's also about learning how to take the right steps to progress our careers to the place we want to be. And hopefully, I think our generation or our children's generation understand that. By all means, hone your craft. Become the absolute best at it that you possibly can. But don't forget, if you like, the business of it. If you really want to sing on stage, you're going to have to make the right moves. You're going to have to do A, B, C, D, E, whatever that is now. I'm not an opera singer so I don't know. But, you need to be doing the right things to move your career forward. And I think that's why I wanted to bring that element into it, that people need to be guided. And I mean, in Sophie's case, she studies a lot outside her voice to try and progress to where she wants to be. Yeah, she observes.
Like me, Julie, and we've talked about this before, you're a Sydney-sider and you've done a fabulous job of grounding readers into 1973 Sydney. Both Margaret and Sophie are not living in suburbia. They are residents of a place affectionately referred to as the Loo or Woolloomooloo, an area which saw a great deal of unrest and political activism at the time. So I wanted to ask you, why there? What was it about that area at that time that made you want to explore it in this novel?
Oh, it's such a colourful area, even today. So down on the wharf, there's the fabulous Overload Hotel, and there's the beautiful apartment buildings right out on the water. It's beautiful. And I remember when I first moved to Woolloomooloo, going for a swim in the Boyd Charlton pool, and you look back and you can see the Domain and the city buildings. And I just stopped swimming and sank back and looked at our beautiful, beautiful city. It is a stunning city, and Woolloomooloo was there, the birthplace of Sydney, one of the birthplaces of Sydney, and it had such a history, and so many events had happened there in Woolloomooloo. Soldiers went off to war and came home from war. So for me, I wanted to choose somewhere that was very historic and that was very Australian, and you can't get much more. I mean, I think even if you say the word Woolloomooloo overseas, people know, because it's such an unusual suburban name. They go, Woolloomooloo, that's in Sydney. Also, though, in Woolloomooloo, there is still a big mix of different populations, and that also is a tiny little pocket handkerchief of a suburb, but it has such a diverse range of people living there that it was actually so educational for me, to see people down there on the wharf, but also, unfortunately, people who are homeless, who have to sleep out at night. It's sobering, but it's also very educational. Sydney is not just glitz and glamour. And Sydney is not all beauty. There's a sad side to Sydney. And I don't think it's realistic to paint a story like this and not talk to some of those things, and particularly the unrest that went on in the 70s in Woolloomooloo when the building developers came in and there was this, Woolloomooloo was under threat. So that was a very pivotal time in the history of Sydney. I count myself fortunate to have lived there.
Julie, if there was one thing that you wanted readers to take away from this novel, what would it be?
Someone else asked me this too, and I want to capture exactly what it is. It's that I think we should embrace how fabulous our country is, our cities are, our people are, the talent that we have in our country. And really, I wanted this novel to sort of showcase that, to say, hey, we've arrived, we're fabulous. Get yourselves to a production. Doesn't have to be opera, but embrace our theatrical arts, all our arts, because you'll be surprised perhaps by how fabulous it is. And I just want people to fall in love with our country the way that I did when I was 9.
Yeah, so well said. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Julie, it's no secret that you've come to novel writing later in your life. Do you think that you could have written this novel any earlier than you did?
No, definitely not.
Tell me about that.
So I wrote, as I said, a few practice novels, which were more sort of just little romance novels. And I was very happy doing that. But as I said, they never got published and they're a little bit formulaic. And I was actually quite happy to do that. But then on that day that I woke up and thought, time to get cracking, I thought, well, if you're going to get cracking, it has to be a book that you're proud to write, that you're happy to write, that has some depth and some, it's not just one linear story. And so, you don't get to be 50 plus 10, as I'm fond of saying, without getting a lot of experience. And the other thing I think is, and I don't want this to sound self-important, but it's so psychologically draining to write a novel and then to go, well, now I have to go out and talk about it. And it's actually quite confronting, and you have to be prepared for that, so I think perhaps if I was a bit younger, it might have been more difficult for me psychologically to come to terms with that, because you kind of put yourself and your talent and your stories out there and open yourself up to criticism. And I don't know if I could have handled it as well when I was younger. And I probably won't handle it very well either now, but you just come from you're a little bit more mature, and you just take a bit, well, it's not going to be everyone's cup of tea, and it's okay, it is what it is. But I think I couldn't have written the characters without having quite a lot of interaction with a lot of different people from different walks of life, and certainly from the world of opera. And I don't think I would have had the maturity, I guess is what I'm saying, to write that book at that time. And I also think, you can write the same kind of story over and over and over and over again, and it won't be the same book. If I started writing this book today, it wouldn't be the same book, I don't think, because it comes at a different time in your experience, in your life experience.
Julie, you may know there are many writers out there who listen to this podcast, and if you had any tips to pass on to them about the process or about getting their novel published, what would they be?
So I boiled this down to 3. So the first thing is you have to know how to write. And I know that probably sounds a little bit condescending, and I don't mean to sound like that, but I worked as a journalist for a few years, and so I was able to hone the craft of writing as well as the art. And because the world of novel writing is so competitive, you do need to have a really good, solid ability to write. And I was fortunate to have had both the art and the craft of it. And so the next thing you have to do is that you have to actually do it. You actually have to sit down and do it. And, that's probably the hard bit. It's a day by day thing. And I've told this story before too, but my girlfriend, she said to me at one stage, I want a page a day and I don't want any more excuses from you. No more excuses.
Wow.
Wow. So that's how I finished it,
Yeah.
So you have to have this absolute tenacity. You have to be tenacious and you have to actually want it. Because if you are at all hesitant and you don't know that you want it, then you won't do it. You have to want it. And because it's going to take every bit of tenacity in you. Even after I was accepted, there were days where I thought, this is so hard. this is so hard, and I'm going like, but I really, really wanted to do it. So that's what I'm talking about with tenacity. The third thing is to just put yourself in the path of people who can help you. So to progress you to publication, because as I said, it's so competitive, and you know about writing, and you've written a book, what are you going to do next? And so that's when I decided to go to Fiona's masterclass. Now, the masterclass is not for everyone, right? It was good for me, but there's other ways that you can also put yourself in front of people who can help you. And that is, you could become a member of the ASA. They have things that can help you. They have writing things that can help you. And they also have a pitch session. You can pitch to actual publishers, or join something like that actually can help you progress what you've done to publication. Never give up.
Julie, I wanted to say congratulations once again on a magnificent debut. Brava, my friend, brava. Wishing you every success with it and the novels that will no doubt follow. Thank you for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Thanks so much, Claudine.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.